The poor woman was put up for sale by her stepfamily for $5 until a lonely, wealthy man. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The sun had barely cleared the ridge when Sadie Bell was led up onto the auction platform at the edge of Cotton Ridge. Her wrists weren't tied, and there wasn't a crowd, just 4 or 5 men leaning against wagon rails, watching like they weren't sure what they were seeing. One of them spit into the dirt. Another muttered something about shame, but no one stepped forward. Sadie didn't look up. Her hands were folded in front of her, shoulders stiff under a too-thin, tobacco-smelling shawl that hung crooked off one shoulder. Her hair, ash-brown and limp from too many days without washing, was knotted in a lazy braid, strands falling loose in the wind. Her boots were cracked and 2 sizes too big. They weren't hers. Nothing she wore was hers. Roy Duggan stood to her left. His shirt clung wet under the arms, and his boots creaked every time he shifted. He grinned, showing the teeth tobacco hadn't taken. "She's a strong girl." He barked to no one in particular, raising his voice like it was a normal Sunday lot sale. "Can cook, clean, mend, even knows how to pull a calf when needed. 21 years old. She'll work for you quiet, won't talk back. We'll start at $5. No one moved. Sadie heard the words, but they didn't land. Her thoughts weren't in her head anymore. They were floating somewhere behind her eyes, where memories of cold floors and early mornings kept repeating. She was used to this kind of silence. The Duggan home had been full of it. Tight-lipped meals, glances like knives, a mother who never stood in her defense, and a man who'd looked at her like she was a fence post, useful only when upright. She wasn't angry. She was tired. Then someone walked out of the livery across the street. Thorne Calder didn't look like a man out shopping. He moved slow, measured, his boots deliberate on the hard-pan dirt. He wore a long, worn wool coat, dark trousers, and a broad hat that shadowed most of his face. His hands were bare, calloused, hanging easy at his sides. The man wasn't young. Gray streaked through the black at his temples. But he stood straight, solid, as if he'd weathered more than most and was still upright because no storm had gotten the best of him yet. He hadn't planned to stop. Thorne had ridden into Cotton Ridge to pick up horseshoe nails, maybe salt. He didn't like town. Too many eyes, too many mouths. He'd kept himself for over a year now. After losing his wife and boy to a fever that swept through the valley like smoke, he hadn't found much to say to anyone. His ranch out west of town had all he needed: animals, quiet, and work that filled the hours. But he caught a glimpse of Sadie on the platform, and it made him stop. Not because she was pretty. He wouldn't have known if she was or wasn't. Not because she looked in need. Most folks out here did. But there was something in her posture. The way her arms were crossed over her middle like she didn't want to be seen. Not guarded, exactly. Something deeper. Something familiar. He stared a moment longer than he meant to, then stepped forward. "How much?" he said, voice low and steady. Roy Duggan blinked, caught off guard. $5, he repeated, then chuckled. "Though if you're serious, I figure she's worth." Thorne reached into the inside of his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He didn't count it, just dropped the whole thing in the dust at Duggan's feet. "She's coming with me." Duggan hesitated, eyeing the bag. That's more than." "You sold her," Thorne said flat. "You don't get another say." It wasn't a threat. It was just final. Sadie hadn't moved. She looked up slowly, unsure what she was supposed to feel. Relief, fear, confusion. Mostly she felt numb. She didn't know the man. Didn't know why he'd stepped forward or what would happen next. Her legs felt unsteady as she stepped off the platform. When she passed Duggan, he didn't meet her eyes. Thorne didn't touch her, just gestured toward his horse and turned, walking slow enough she could follow. She did, wordless, half expecting someone to stop them, to say there'd been a mistake. No one did. They rode in silence out of town. She sat side saddle, gripping the edge of his pack as the road stretched toward open land and hills marked with black oaks. No one spoke. He didn't ask where she was from. She didn't ask where they were going. She was afraid to hope. And Thorne, he didn't know what he was doing, not exactly. All he knew was the way she'd looked on that platform, like someone who'd already been left behind too many times. He knew that feeling. knew how it shaped a person from the inside out. And for the first time in a long while, he'd seen a reason to act. Not out of pity, not to rescue anyone, just because it felt right. That was enough. The road west of Cotton Ridge was narrow, rutted by wagon wheels and bordered by dry grass that whispered against the wind. They rode for nearly 2 hours before either of them said a word. Sadie kept her head low, her hands clenched in her lap as the gelding beneath her swayed with each step. The saddle was too wide, the leather worn and cracked, but it was the first time she'd ridden anything that didn't belong to the Duggans. She stole glances at Thorne Calder now and then, trying to make sense of the man. He didn't look back. He just rode ahead, jaw set, eyes scanning the horizon like someone who'd learned to expect trouble even when the sky was clear. She couldn't read him. There was no kindness in his face, but there wasn't cruelty either. Just something guarded, like a man holding something broken in his chest and trying not to let it slip out. She finally spoke when the ranch came into view, a modest house of rough-cut timber, a wide porch, windmill turning in the distance, fenced pasture to the left, a rust-colored barn to the right. 2 horses grazed behind the split-rail fence, their ears twitching as the riders approached. "You live here alone?" she asked, voice low. Thorne nodded. Been a while now. She didn't press further, didn't ask why, but she was already filling in the silence. Maybe a wife, maybe children, maybe a story buried too deep to speak of. She understood the shape of grief, even if the details were missing. It sat heavy in the corners of the place. He dismounted first, then offered a hand to help her down. She hesitated, then took it. His grip was firm, steady, warm. Not invasive, just solid. The touch surprised her. Not in the way she expected, it didn't scare her. It just reminded her of how long it had been since someone had touched her without taking something. He didn't lead her inside right away, just pointed toward the barn. "Horse needs tending. You rest if you like." "I can help," she said quickly, instinctively. Her voice had that sharp edge that came from years of always having to prove her use. Thorne looked at her, then nodded once. "All right." She followed him into the barn, the smell of hay and old wood settling over her like a memory. He handed her a brush without a word. She moved to the gelding, fingers working with practiced ease. She'd tended animals her whole life. At the Duggan place, the livestock came first, and she'd learned how to work fast and quiet. She felt his eyes on her as she moved, but he didn't interfere. Just watched, maybe measuring if she really knew what she was doing. Or maybe trying to figure out how a girl like her ended up sold like a mule. "You got family?" he asked after a while. She hesitated, still brushing. "None that count." He gave a short grunt, acknowledgement, not pity. He didn't ask more. After the barn, he led her to the house. The inside was clean but sparse. A small wood stove, 1 table, 2 chairs, and shelves lined with tins and jars. A stack of firewood sat by the hearth. On the far wall, a rifle rested above the mantel. No photographs, no lace curtains, just function and quiet. "You can have a room upstairs," he said. "Ain't much, but it's yours." Sadie blinked. She hadn't expected that. "You sure?" "Would not have offered if I wasn't." She climbed the narrow stairs, footsteps light from habit. The room was plain, a narrow bed, a window looking out over the fields, a chair by the wall. But it was clean, and it was hers. That detail stayed with her. She sat on the bed, hands resting on her knees. No one had ever given her a room of her own. No one had ever told her something was hers without waiting to take it back. Downstairs, she heard Thorne stoking the fire. No raised voices, no demands, just the creak of the house settling and the quiet rhythm of a man who didn't mind silence. That night, she lay awake under a quilt that smelled of cedar and dust. Her mind replayed the auction, the pouch of coins, the firm way he'd said, "You don't get another say." She didn't know what to make of it. If he expected something later, if this was just a pause before the cost came due. But nothing came. No footsteps at her door. No voices through the floorboards. Just stillness. And downstairs, Thorne sat at the table with a cup of black coffee going cold in his hand, staring at the empty chair across from him. He didn't know what he'd just brought into his home. He only knew she didn't deserve what had been done to her. And when he'd seen her up on that platform, small and humiliated, something inside him stirred for the first time in a long while. Something like recognition. She needed somewhere to go. And maybe, just maybe, he needed someone to stay. Neither of them understood it yet. But the first stone had been laid. The next morning came with no sound but the wind nudging against the eaves and the chickens making slow noise out back. Sadie woke before the sun rose fully, blinking against the weak light that crept in through the curtains. For a long moment, she just lay there, not moving, listening, waiting for footsteps, for a door to creak open, for someone to bark her name like they used to. But none came. Downstairs, she heard movement. Wood on the stove, the dull clang of the kettle. No voices, just routine. The house moved like Thorne himself, quiet, deliberate, no wasted noise. She pulled on her boots, tied her hair back, and stepped down the stairs without sound. When she entered the kitchen, he was already there, pouring boiling water over coffee grounds in an old tin pot, shoulders stiff from a night spent in the chair. He glanced at her. There's bread and apples. Sadie gave a short nod, not trusting her voice just yet. She moved to the table and ate without speaking. She didn't look at him much, unsure of what he expected, or if he expected anything. But after the second bite, he surprised her. "You sleep all right?" She paused, hand halfway to her mouth. That wasn't the kind of question men asked where she came from. Not without strings. But his tone wasn't prying. Just matter of fact. "Better than I'm used to," she said quietly. Thorne nodded once and left it there. They spent the morning in work. Sadie followed his lead out back, helped with the chickens, fed the horses, checked the fencing. It was the kind of labor she knew, muscle memory, dirt under the nails, simple tasks that filled the hours and kept the mind from wandering too far. But there was a difference here. No one barked at her. No one told her she was too slow. When she missed a nail on the fence, Thorne just handed her another and moved on. By mid-morning, her cheeks were red from the wind, her hands raw from the wood. She didn't mind. Back at the barn, Thorne stepped aside and lit a cigarette, resting a boot against a feed barrel. He watched her for a while, arms crossed, brow low. "You worked like this before?" he asked. Sadie looked up from the pitchfork. "Since I was a kid." He didn't ask what kind of people would put a child to labor like that. He didn't have to. He already had an idea. "You don't owe me for none of it," he said after a beat. "Not the ride, not the food, not the bed." Sadie turned fully then, straightening her back. "Why'd you take me?" He didn't answer right away. Just took a long drag, blew out slow. "Didn't sit right. Them auctioning you like that," he said. "Didn't plan on talking anybody home. Just couldn't ride past it." She watched him closely, try to see if there was anything else behind the words. Expectation, a bargain unspoken. But there wasn't. He looked the same as he had in town. Tired, weather-worn, but firm. Steady in a way that unsettled her, only because she wasn't used to it. Sadie looked down. "You should know I don't got much to give. I ain't a skin for anything," Thorne said, his voice quiet but sure. They left it there. By evening, she had started a fire in the stove and heated leftover stew she found on the shelf. She didn't ask if she could. She just did it. He didn't stop her. When they sat across from each other at the table, the silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It had softened into something neutral, almost familiar. Sadie noticed, then, something she'd missed before, a small frame tucked high on the mantel. She rose slowly and reached for it. It was dusty, the glass cracked. Inside was a drawing, not a photo. A pencil sketch of a boy and a woman. The boy looked maybe 5. The woman, no older than Sadie now. Thor didn't look up. "My wife and son." She set the frame back without a word. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her arms were sore, her back ached, but it was the good kind of tired. Honest labor. No one yelling. No one grabbing at her. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was waiting for the floor to give out. Downstairs, Thorne stared at the fireplace, the chair beside his still empty, his coffee cold again. Neither of them spoke about tomorrow, but it was already becoming a routine. And somewhere, unspoken, they both knew this wasn't temporary anymore. By the end of the first full week, Sadie stopped flinching every time Thorne entered a room. It wasn't something she noticed at first. It just happened, gradually, like the way you stop bracing for a slap that never comes. She started humming under her breath while sweeping the porch, started leaving her boots by the door instead of clutching them to her chest at night. She still kept to herself mostly, but her movements were different now, less stiff, more rooted. Like maybe, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't trying to disappear into the walls. Thorne noticed. He didn't mention it, but he saw it in the way she walked from the barn without looking over her shoulder. The way she stood at the stove with her sleeves rolled up, focused, not fearful. He wasn't a man who smiled often, but the corners of his mouth softened a little more each day. One morning, while she was hauling a bucket of water from the well, he approached and handed her a folded parcel wrapped in brown paper and twine. He didn't say anything, just held it out and waited. Sadie hesitated. "What's this?" "Open it." She loosened the twine and peeled the paper back to find a light blue cotton dress inside. Plain but new. No holes. No stains. Not a hand-me-down. She touched it like it might vanish. Her throat went dry. "I didn't ask for this." "I know. You didn't have to. I know that too." There was nothing else to say. He turned and went back to his chores. She stood there a long while before going inside to try it on. It fit. That evening, she came down to supper wearing it. He looked up briefly when she entered the room, then nodded once. Approval without ceremony. They ate in silence like always, but something had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just shifted. After dinner, Sadie stepped onto the porch, mug of warm water in hand. The wind had settled. The sky was stretched wide with stars, clear and sharp. She stood there, staring out over the dark pasture, feeling the hem of her new dress brush against her legs. Behind her, she heard the front door creak. Thorne stepped out, a cigarette tucked in the corner of his mouth. "You ever plan to go back?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. "To the Duggins? Anywhere." Sadie shook her head. "Ain't got anywhere." He nodded, taking a drag, then exhaled. "All right then." She turned to him. "Why'd you really take me in?" He looked at her, eyes unreadable. "Don't rightly know. Just didn't want to leave you there." She stared at him a second longer. "Folks in town, they say things. About you." He gave a dry grunt. "Let him. They say you buried your boy under a tree." He didn't flinch, just looked out toward the pasture. "I did. I'm sorry." He nodded again. "Me too." And that was it. They stood in the quiet, the porch creaking beneath their weight. Sadie wasn't sure what this was, whatever existed between them. It wasn't courtship. It wasn't charity. But it was something steady, and it didn't scare her. Not anymore. The next morning, she woke up before the sun again and walked downstairs to find a rocking chair on the porch beside the one Thorne always sat in. It hadn't been there the day before. She ran her hand along the armrest. Rough wood, newly sanded. Her heart thudded. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. But that evening, when she stepped outside with her mug and sat down in it, Thorne passed her a piece of cornbread and said, "Weather's turning. Might get frost next week." And just like that, it was clear she wasn't passing through anymore. 3 weeks had passed since the day Thorne called her brought Sadie Bell home from Cotton Ridge. In that time, no deal had been spoken, no arrangement laid out between them. Still, they worked in rhythm. He mended fences and led the horses to water. She kept the stove hot, patched torn cloth, milked the goats without being asked. Some days passed with only a handful of words exchanged. It didn't feel like distance. It felt like room to breathe. Sadie had begun to settle in, but the unease wasn't fully gone. Every time a rider passed on the horizon or a hawk cried overhead, she tensed for something she couldn't name. The Duggan name hadn't been spoken since the day she left them behind, but their weight hadn't fully lifted either. It lingered in her sleep, in the way her hands twitched when the house got too quiet. Thorne noticed. He saw it when she overboiled the kettle, when she startled at the creak of the barn door, when she watched the dirt road with her jaw tight, as if waiting for someone to come claim what wasn't theirs anymore. That afternoon, he came back from town with a small book in his coat. He didn't offer it right away. He waited until she was out back hanging laundry, the wind tugging at her sleeves and the line between them still fragile, but growing steadier. He handed it to her with no explanation. She turned it over. Wuthering Heights. Her fingers ran along the spine, slow and cautious. "I ain't read much," she said. He gave a short nod. "Didn't figure you had the time." She blinked. "Why give me this?" He shrugged. "Figured you might want to try." She didn't open it right then. Just held it close like it was something private, something earned. That night, she read the first page by oil lamp. When she heard Thorne's boots across the floor downstairs, she tucked it under the blanket like it was something she didn't want taken away. He heard her humming again the next morning. The weather turned colder, just like he'd said. They began chopping wood earlier in the day and brought in the livestock before the sun dropped too far. At night, the wind pressed against the house hard enough to rattle the windows, but inside stayed warm. Sadie started placing a second mug out before he sat down. He never commented on it, just filled them both without a word. One evening after supper, Thorne finally spoke about something she hadn't dared to ask. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. Sadie folded the hem of her dress where she sat, staring at the floor. "Thought about it a lot, but not lately. You ain't bound here." She looked up, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in days. "I know that." He nodded slow. "Just want you to stay 'cause you want to, not 'cause you feel cornered." She studied him for a long second. "I ain't never had the chance to want anything. But if I'm honest," she swallowed, "this place don't feel like a trap. That's a first." That was all it took. No promises, no oaths. Just quiet understanding. Still, there were questions left hanging between them. One Sadie hadn't had the nerve to ask, until that night, sitting near the fire, the flames dancing low on the hearth and the wind howling behind the shutters. "Your wife," she said softly. "You ever talk about her?" Thorne stared at the fire for a moment before answering. "Not much to say. Her name was Annie. Our boy was Jacob. He was 5. Took sick in the spring. Didn't make it through summer." Sadie's fingers tightened on her knees. "I'm sorry. So am I." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was shared. Sadie set her mug down and stood to take her leave, but before climbing the stairs, she paused. "You know, if you ever want to talk more, I can just sit quiet and listen." Thorne gave a small nod, eyes still on the fire. "That'd be all right." And just like that, a new piece fell into place, unforced, unspoken. They were no longer two people trying to survive each other's silence. They were starting to live inside it together. The first snow came early that year, dusting the hills around Calder Ranch before November had fully settled. It wasn't heavy, just enough to change the color of the world and make the porch steps slick by morning. Sadie stood at the window, mug in hand, watching the flakes fall in slow spirals. She'd never stayed long enough anywhere to see the season change. Never saw a place shift from dust to frost and still be standing there when it did. Behind her, Thorne was fixing the stove's pipe. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, hands smudged black with ash. He didn't say anything, but Sadie could tell he was watching her reflection in the glass. She turned finally. "You ever get tired of the quiet?" she asked. "No." She nodded. "Me neither." They worked through the cold with the same rhythm they'd fallen into. She patched coats. He reinforced the barn roof. At night, they sat by the fire and shared what little news Thorne picked up in town. Cotton Ridge wasn't far, but neither of them had reason to ride in much. Still, Sadie couldn't help but wonder. "Did anyone ask about me?" she asked one night, her voice tight but calm. Thorne looked up from the tin he was carving shavings into for kindling. "No." No one said a word. Sadie nodded, almost disappointed. "I figured they wouldn't." He studied her for a second. "You want someone to come look in?" "No," she said quickly. Sometimes it's worse knowing they don't care." She hadn't spoken the Duggan name in weeks. She didn't need to. He understood. The kind of cruelty that hides behind a family name doesn't leave bruises. It leaves questions. Was it always my fault? Did I deserve it? Should I have tried harder? Thorne didn't offer empty comfort. He just said, "You're here now," and that was enough. Later that week, she found a bundle of cloth left on the end of her bed. It wasn't wrapped like a gift, just folded and placed neat. Inside were 2 blouses and a thick wool shawl. Sadie ran her hand across the stitching. It wasn't store-bought. The seams were slightly uneven, the thread different in parts. He'd mended them himself. She walked downstairs and found him oiling the hinges on the barn door. "Thank you," she said. He didn't look up. Winter's rough out here. Figured you'd need it." That night, she made stew from what little meat they had left in the smokehouse. It wasn't much, but she seasoned it like her mama used to before everything turned cold and hard. Thorne took a bite and paused longer than usual, then nodded. "This tastes like something," he said. Sadie smiled. "Something good." "Yeah." They fell quiet after that, but not empty. The silence they shared had become a place to rest. Still, there were parts of each other they hadn't yet seen. Questions neither had asked. One came the next morning, without warning. Thorne was in the pasture, mending a broken fence post when a rider came up the trail. Dust on his coat, wide hat pulled low, rifle tied to the saddle. Sadie spotted him from the porch, heart lodging in her throat before she could think. Her hands froze around the handle of the water bucket. For one awful moment, she thought it was Roy Duggan. It wasn't, but it didn't matter. The rider slowed at the gate. Thorne straightened and stepped forward. The two spoke low for a minute or two before the man turned and rode off again, disappearing down the trail without ever glancing toward the house. Sadie waited inside, chest tight. When Thorne came in, brushing dirt from his gloves, she finally asked, "Who was that?" "Neighbor from Northridge. Heard a story going round in town." "What kind of story?" He hesitated. "That I bought a girl from the Duggans." Sadie's face burned. Her fingers curled around the edge of the table. "And what did you say?" "I told him that's a lie. Told him you live here. Told him anyone wants to say otherwise can come talk to me direct." Her jaw tensed. "They think I was bought." "I don't care what they think," Thorne said. "Only what you do." She didn't speak for a while. Then, carefully, "You ever regret bringing me here?" "No." She looked at him. "Not even a little." His answer came without pause. "Not even once." She exhaled, tension leaving her body in small pieces. Later, she sat on the porch while he finished chopping wood. Her book lay open on her lap, but she wasn't reading. She was just there, present, at home. Inside, the fire crackled. Outside, the wind howled past the fence line but didn't get in. The next week passed in deep cold. Snow thickened over the hills, covering the ground in uneven layers that crackled under boots each morning. Thorne spent most daylight hours hauling firewood or checking on the animals. Sadie kept the hearth alive and the kitchen warm, soaking beans overnight and kneading dough with sleeves rolled to the elbow, her knuckles red from scrubbing. There was a rhythm now, something that resembled life rather than survival. She no longer counted how many days had passed since she left the Duggans. She no longer jumped at the sound of hooves. But that didn't mean the past was gone. It came back in small ways, like when she found a half-torn apron in the barn and froze, thinking of the one she used to wear for May Duggan. Or when she caught herself asking Thorne for permission to wash his clothes. And his quiet, "You don't need to ask," landed harder than any slap ever had. She was healing slowly, but pieces still ached. One night, after dinner, Thorne brought out a wooden box from his storage room. He set it on the table, brushed the dust off, and motioned for her to sit. "What's this?" she asked. "Something you might like." Inside were old keepsakes, worn dice, a silver harmonica, letters folded and yellowed. But at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, was a small paint set and a journal with blank pages. Sadie stared at it like it was too delicate to touch. "I found it after my boy passed," Thorne said. "It was Annie's. She liked to draw, never had the heart to throw it out." Sadie blinked. "You're giving this to me?" Figured it shouldn't sit in a box if someone could use it. Her fingers ran along the edge of the book. She didn't remember the last time someone gave her something without wanting something back. She looked up. "Thank you." He just nodded and turned to put another log on the fire. She began drawing that same night. Nothing fancy, just quiet shapes. A horse grazing. The barn door. The back of Thorne's coat while he chopped wood. She didn't show them to him, but he saw the open pages when he passed by. Said nothing. But the next day, he built her a small desk out of old fence wood and placed it near the window upstairs. By the end of the week, she had a place to draw. He had started sleeping better. They sat on the porch each evening, mugs in hand, words growing slowly between them like new grass. But peace doesn't always last. One morning, before the sun rose, a knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps. Not urgent, just sure. Thorne stood, pulled his coat from a hook, and opened it slowly. Outside stood Roy Duggan. He hadn't changed much, still squinting like the world owed him money, still chewing on a toothpick with yellow teeth, still wearing clothes he thought made him look richer than he was. But this time, he didn't have that smug grin. Sadie stood frozen in the kitchen, heart hammering so loud she thought they might hear it through the walls. Roy didn't look at her. Called her, he said. I came to talk civil. Thorne said nothing. Roy cleared his throat. Seems there's been a mistake. My girl, Sadie, she left before we could work things out. My wife's sick over it. She didn't mean nothing by the auction. Things got out of hand. Sadie stepped forward then, not all the way, but enough that he saw her. Roy shifted uncomfortably. Look, I just came to get her back. We'll treat her better. Ain't no hard feelings. Thorne didn't blink. You sold her. Yeah, well, maybe that was wrong. Sadie's voice came before she even knew she meant to speak. You fed me scraps. Made me sleep in the stable. You didn't want me. You just didn't want to lose another body to work. Roy raised his palms. Now listen, Sadie. No, Thorne said, his tone quiet but final. You done listening? She's not yours. She was never yours. Roy's mouth twisted. You buy her for $5, and now you think you own her. I didn't buy her, Thorne said. I gave you coin to shut you up. But she ain't property. She's family now. The silence that followed was sharp. Roy looked between them, realized there was no room left to talk, then spat into the dirt, turned, and walked back to his horse. Sadie watched him ride off without a word. Her knees felt weak, but she stood her ground until he was just a dust trail on the horizon. Inside, she sat down slowly at the table. Thorne poured her a mug of water. She stared into it for a moment. I kept thinking he might come, that maybe you'd change your mind if he did. I didn't. She looked at him. Why not? He was quiet for a second. Then, because you're not a burden. And I don't let good folks get dragged back into hell. Sadie's eyes burned. She didn't cry, just reached across the table and set her hand over his. Not tightly, just firm. That night, the fire burned longer than usual. No one said much, but something had changed. The past had tried to crawl back, and they'd shut the door on it for good. 2 days passed since Roy Duggan rode up and rode off, and he hadn't returned. Not with papers, not with the sheriff, not with more lies. Thorne figured he wouldn't. Men like Roy barked loud, but didn't push where they knew they'd be bitten. Still, he kept his shotgun loaded by the door and made sure the stock was oiled clean. Not out of fear, just preparation. Sadie hadn't spoken much since that morning. She worked like she always did, steady hands, focused movements, but the silence around her was different now. It wasn't retreat, it was wait. A door had been shut, and doors, once closed, tend to rattle in the wind before they stay put. Thorne gave her space. He didn't hover, didn't push. He built a gate on the east side of the fence and said nothing when she watched from the porch instead of helping. He understood what it meant to have something old pulled up by the root. It takes time for the ground to settle again. That afternoon, she brought out the sketchbook and placed it on the table in front of him while he peeled potatoes. He wiped his hands, flipped it open. Inside were her drawings, quiet, simple, unpolished. One of the barn, one of him mending a boot by the fire, one of the porch chairs side by side. But on the last page was something different, a drawing of herself. Not the girl who'd stood at auction with arms folded tight. This Sadie was seated at the window desk, light falling on her shoulder, sleeves rolled up, hair half loose, eyes forward. You did this? He asked. She nodded. Didn't think I'd draw myself. Wasn't sure I'd want to. He looked at the sketch again. It's good. I drew it yesterday, after Roy left. He nodded slowly. You look like yourself. I think I finally do. She sat across from him then, fingers laced, her eyes clearer than they'd ever been. Back when I was with the Duggans, I didn't talk much. Not just because of them, but because I didn't think I had anything worth saying. I used to think if I stayed quiet enough, I'd disappear. Thorne didn't interrupt. She continued, slow. When I came here, I didn't know if this was just another stop. Another place I'd be useful until I wasn't. But you never asked for anything. You just let me be. He stared at her for a long moment. You're not a guest here anymore, Sadie. She swallowed. I don't want to be. The silence after wasn't heavy. It was warm, like the air after a hard frost finally breaks. The next morning, she didn't wait for him to wake first. She started the fire herself, cooked the eggs, set the table. He came downstairs to the smell of coffee and her soft humming. She didn't turn when he entered, just slid a plate to his usual spot. "I'm staying," she said without looking up. "You already knew, but I wanted to say it." He's Saturday, all right. They ate without rush, no words needed. Later that day, he brought down a folded piece of linen from the attic. It was old, embroidered faintly, the threads pale from time, but still holding. He placed it in her hands. "What's this?" she asked. "My wife's. She used to hang it over the window come spring. Figured you might like it." Sadie unfolded it slowly. "You sure?" She'd have wanted someone decent to have it. She smiled, soft, quiet. "You think I'm decent?" He met her eyes. "I think you're strong. I think you've been through more than most folks could handle. And you're still standing. That counts for more than most." That night, they sat on the porch together, bundled in shawls. The snow packed hard around the yard. The stars blinked clear overhead. No words, no past. Just two people who didn't leave and didn't have to. And inside, Sadie's room glowed with oil light, the embroidered cloth now hanging in the window, moving gently with the breeze. The days began to stretch longer as winter thinned out its grip. Snow softened into slush, water trickled under fence posts, and the wind changed from bitter to brisk. The ranch, once silent under white, began to creak and breathe again, like the land itself was thawing. Sadie was different now, and it showed in the smallest things. She no longer waited for permission before reaching for something, didn't ask before picking herbs from the garden patch near the barn. She moved with quiet purpose through the house, her shoulders no longer hunched, her voice stronger when she spoke, even if it was only a few words at a time. The townsfolk talked. Of course they did. Now and then, Thorne would ride into Cotton Ridge for feed or mail, and he'd hear in the way folks tilted their heads or kept their voices low around him. Some said he was crazy for keeping her there. Others said it wasn't right, what he'd done, taking her in like that, calling her family without a paper to prove it. He didn't answer them. He didn't have to. The sheriff never came. Roy Duggan never showed his face again. And nobody was fool enough to challenge a man like Thorne Calder when he looked him straight in the eye. One afternoon, Sadie stood by the fence, watching the horses in the thawing field, when Thorne approached her with something folded under his arm. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned beside her, the sky wide and clean behind them. Then he held it out. A simple wool shawl, deep green. "Made a trip last week when I picked up supplies," he said. Sadie took it slowly. "What? You always look cold." She smiled, then glanced at him sideways. "You always notice more than you let on." "I do." They stood in silence. A wind rolled through the grass, bringing the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. She turned toward him. "Do you ever think about starting over?" He met her eyes. "I already have." That evening, she baked a loaf of bread. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The smell filled the house. Thorne set a second place without needing to be asked. They ate beside each other in the quiet, her hand brushing his when she passed the butter. Neither pulled away. After the meal, as they cleared the dishes, she paused at the sink and asked the question that had been sitting between them for weeks. "You ever think about wanting more than just quiet?" He dried his hands and turned toward her. "Like what?" "Like a life. Not just getting through the days." He studied her. "Sadie, I got a house with a roof that doesn't leak, food that doesn't run out, and peace that doesn't come from a bottle. And now I got you here. That's a life to me." She swallowed, lips parting just slightly. "So this is it? This is home. It is if you want it to be." "I do." That night, she didn't go up to her room right away. Instead, she lingered by the fire while he set another log in place. She sat in her chair. He sat in his, and slowly, quietly, she reached over and rested her hand on his arm. He didn't flinch. He didn't shift. He turned his hand over, laced their fingers together. No declarations. No ceremony. Just the simple act of choosing each other. By the time spring fully arrived, the house had changed in subtle ways. A new curtain on the back door. A tin cup of dried flowers on the kitchen shelf. The porch chairs sanded smooth. Her sketchbook set open near the window, a pencil tucked beside it. People in town kept talking. Let them. Sadie Bell had not been bought. She had been claimed, with respect, with silence, and with the kind of staying that could only be done by someone who knew the cost of leaving. And Thorne Calder, once a man buried in grief, had not rescued her. He had built something alongside her. A life. One neither of them would ever walk away from.